Okay, sláinte everybody, cheers. My name's David Whish-Wilson. I'm the author of I think this is the 8th novel I'll be talking about tonight. I hope you've all had a wonderful day, and if not, I hope you're enjoying a kind of a restorative cup of tea or a medicinal beer or wine. I'm having a wee nip of Irish whiskey for reasons that will become clear in a moment. I distilled this one myself, and it's actually turned out all right. So yeah, I'm coming to you from Wallilup, Fremantle in Western Australia. It's Quabadak Budjar. It's beautiful country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Please feel free to say hello as you come in. I'd like to see where you're all from, and also fire away questions. Yeah, so I'm primarily a crime novelist, but I've written a few historical novels, but my day job is teaching creative writing. So if you've got any questions about the novels, if you've got any questions about the craft, fire away. And yeah, good evening to you all. So better take a sip first. That's good. All right, so the novel I'm talking to you about tonight is The Sawdust House. Like I said, my third historical novel with crimey elements. It's a novel, but based on the remarkable true story, remarkable, I think, of an unknown Irish Australian convict who escaped to America in his early 20s from Australia. And within a few years, he had become probably Australia's first international sporting export. He became the American national boxing champion. He was born in Cork in 1813. He was sent to Australia as a 13-year-old for stealing for stealing a handkerchief as a pickpocket. He was sentenced to 14 years hard labour, and boy did he do hard labour. He was an untamable character. He was a serial absconder, and as a result, he kept getting sent to worse and worse places. And at the age of 16, he ended up in Moreton Bay penal colony, penal establishment, which was about the worst place I can think of to be sent in the world at that stage. He started boxing in Australia as a way of raising money so that he could escape, which he did. He escaped on a whaler and became very well known pretty quickly in New York. He's often considered to be the father of American boxing. Introducing, it was illegal in those days, it was all bare knuckles. But this novel it's not really about boxing. It's more about the community of Australians who washed up in San Francisco in the 1849 gold rush. My second historical crime novel, The Coves, also covers this kind of area. So it's about this gang of wild Australian men and women who rocked up in San Francisco in 1849. And hello, David from Ballarat, and David from Wendouree, and Wendy from Wagga Wagga. Thanks for joining in. And yeah, fire away any questions. I'm totally shameless. Happy to talk about anything. So I came across the character of Yankee Sullivan, my main character, while I was doing the research for The Coves. I was in San Francisco, and I read a little bit about him, and he plays a walk-on part in that novel, The Coves. But I was curious as to why I'd never heard of this guy. I mean, he's very well known in America. He was completely unknown in Australia. And, you know, I'm largely a crime fiction writer. So that I couldn't bear that mystery. I needed to find out the true story behind him. Now, nobody knew his real name, and that was the real problem. So I spent many years trying to find out who he was. And with the help of a couple of great local historians, I was able to find that out, and then the story fell into place. So he's been caught up in one of the great purges in San Francisco of Australian criminals. It happened in 1849 and again in 1856 because the Americans, they just got sick of these Australian criminals. They lynched a few, they exiled a few, and they burnt down Australian businesses. It's where we get the word kangaroo court from, for example. It became very bad to be known as an Australian, and lots of people ceased calling themselves Australian as a result. Yankee finds himself, and this is based on true story, Yankee finds himself in jail on what he assumes is death row, and he's not eating, he's not sleeping, his mental health is declining. He's spent a lot of his life in jail. He's in his early 40s. He's been in jail in London. He grew up in Whitechapel, despite being Irish. Spent a lot of hard jail time in Australia. He was jailed in New York for boxing, and here he is back in San Francisco, and he's in jail again. So he's telling his story like Scheherazade, I suppose, as a way of forestalling the kind of the grimness of his situation. Hello, David from Wendouree. Hello, David. Oh, hello, Jenny from Jenny from Canberra. My mistake. And hello, Meredith from Wendouree. And hello, Claire from Brisbane. It's fine to be late. I'm often late. So that's, in a nutshell, it's a kind of a two-hander. We've got Yankee Sullivan. He's in jail. He's afraid. His worst fear is that he'll get sent back to Australia as an escaped convict, and he starts to narrate his story. The novel is essentially a two-hander. He's narrating his story to a young Mormon journalist, because the other interesting thing about San Francisco is it was an early Mormon kind of colony too. He's narrating his story to a young Mormon journalist who is kind of interested in his boxing career, but Yankee doesn't really want to talk about boxing. He wants to tell the stories from his life as a way of distracting himself from his situation. I might just see if I've got any questions. Not yet. Love my book. Thank you very much, Angie. That's much appreciated. So do fire any questions in. So it's essentially a two-hander. It's structured quite unusually for me. Normally I write novels in quite a linear fashion, particularly the crime novels. But in this one, you've got a man sitting in jail. He thinks it might be his last days. He's narrating his story to a young journalist who he sees things in the journalist that he wishes he had if he'd had a life with different opportunities. And the journalist sees things in Yankee Sullivan, a kind of a certain flamboyance, a certain love of storytelling, and a certain kind of bravery, which he lacks as an introverted kind of character. He's more like me in that respect. So they start telling one another stories. But Yankee, the novels doesn't use chapters. So there are passages where he will go off on a story. And one thing I really loved about writing this book was the fact that Yankee started talking to me early on. The book wouldn't have been possible without that, of course. But he loves telling stories. On other occasions, he just responds with a couple of sentences. And this was an interesting experiment for me, writing and using this kind of structure. I don't know if you'll be able to see, but some pages, it's one line, and on the other, just one paragraph. And on others, it's much more kind of expansive. So I've tried to use, I guess, what the poets use, white space, empty parts of the page, to try and kind of control the pacing of the story, and to try and distill the language down, hopefully, into something that is, has maximum poetry in it. So meaning is layered, and it's working by way of suggestion as well. And then, of course, there's Yankee when he's alone in his cell. He describes his early childhood and his dreams and many, many kinds of things. I'll just see if there's a question coming in. Can you tell us, Jenny Jones, I haven't got my glasses on, my apologies, has asked, David, can you tell us what you thought of the cover and how much input you had into the final choice? Yes, great question. So I published with Fremantle Press, and one of the great things about being a Fremantle Press author is not only the wonderful editor and publisher I work with, Georgia Richter, but I do get a fair choice with the cover. So the tone, because of Yankee's Irishness, the color is kind of that beautiful green. It's got a picture of a man's back. I'm hoping everyone can see it quite clearly. And And imprinted on his back, almost as though it was a tattoo, is an actual painting of a Yankee Sullivan fight when he was in New York fighting for the American national title. It was the biggest sporting event in America up to that time. It was the first time that the telegraph was used. A reporter at the event found out the result, rode his bicycle presumably straight down to the nearest telegraph station, and that news went all across America within minutes, and then all across the world as well. But I genuinely love the cover. It captures something about Yankee Sullivan's vulnerability, the physicality of the man, but also, the pretty ugly reality of what was quite a bloodthirsty sport in those days. When I was researching, sorry, I'm getting stuff popping up on my screen. When I was researching, I was interested in his life story as well. He was a much mythologized character in America. Lots was written about him, a couple of books even. He became very, very, very celebrated as an Irishman because at some point he got on a ship back to Britain, and he challenged the British boxing champion to a bout, despite being an escaped Irish-Australian convict. And of course, if he'd been arrested, he may well have been hung and certainly sent back to Australia. And he won that bout, and just in time too, because the word got out that he was an escaped convict, and he just made it back to America by the skin of his teeth. But when he arrived, everyone loved that particular story. So there are lots of stories like that about him, but that wasn't really what got me interested in the story. It was the fact that his wife, his second wife, had said, as you would expect for a man in his position, he was actually quite vulnerable. He was melancholic. He had trouble sleeping. And when I did learn his real name, when I did read about his history in Australia, that's hardly surprising. He was pretty brutalized. However, he's also an optimistic kind of character. But yeah, I do love the cover. Thanks, Janelle. Wendy Kendall has asked, you have a very eclectic background in occupation. Yes, that's right. While overseas, has this been helpful in your writing and teaching writing? I think the short answer to that is absolutely. For those of you who haven't read it, when I was 18, that's not in the bio actually. When I was 18, I got my first kind of job. I was working up on the mines like so many West Australian boys, just as a labourer, and I saved what I thought was a massive amount of money, $1,000, and I bought a one-way ticket to Thailand. From there, I made my way to Hong Kong, and I made my way to Europe, and I became kind of addicted to that life. So I ended up traveling around the world for about 10 years and not really doing much. I was pretty lazy. I didn't really have any great ambitions. I had started writing, and I had a few short stories published in Australia, luckily, while I was out there doing that. But yeah, I did a number of different jobs. Probably the best job for me as a future storyteller is being a bartender. It's a great job for any young writer out there who's interested in putting themselves in a situation where you hear stories. Obviously, there's taxi driving and other things, but being a bartender is wonderful, particularly if you're a kind of a shy dude like me. People will tell you their stories. You know, sometimes you just have to say, "How you going?" and then you'll hear amazing stories. So being a bartender, but also, yeah, just all the other jobs like being a labourer and some of the wacky stuff I used to do, selling stuff on the street and being a drug trial guinea pig once or twice. All great material. I tend not to write about my own life. I don't find myself particularly interesting, but in the course of those experiences, I came across many, many stories. And particularly, I used to live in Africa. I lived in Africa for a few years, and that's really where I found I needed to start writing because I had stopped writing when I became a teenager. I needed to start writing again to try and make sense of the crazy world around me. I was essentially living on the street, I suppose, living very hand to mouth. I was making a living on the black market. It was a very crazy, chaotic kind of life, and starting to tell stories, that's where it really kicked in. Writing's how I make sense of the world, and reading as well, as I'm sure is the case for many. view. I hope that answered your question, Wendy. Thank you, Angie. That style made it a real page turner. Yeah, thanks for saying that. One thing we really wanted to work on, which was, and it was a bit of a gamble because, like I said, it's not a conventional kind of novel, and I haven't deliberately made it difficult for readers, but I also, you could say, I haven't made it easy either, because it's not absolutely clear. There are no chapter numbers, and it's not immediately clear who is speaking on which page. So that did, of course, create some anxiety. But like I said, working with my wonderful editor, we moved a few things around. We tried to write it so that this is something I learned from being a crime writer. Whatever kind of chapter you're going with, whether it's one line in the case of this or a chapter of several pages, you always want to finish on a point of kind of rising tension, so that when you start the next chapter or the next passage, there's a little bit of intrigue, there's a little bit of excitement. We tried to maintain that all the way through. I'm not in a position to say whether it worked or not, of course, but thank you, Wendy, for saying that. That's great. Oh, sorry, thank you, Angie, for saying that. I'm glad you found it a page turner, because that was definitely our aim. Even though it's a historical novel, again, this is something I learned from crime fiction. It's one of the great pleasures of me that I get from reading, because, of course, as a writer, before I'm a writer, I'm a reader. It's wanting to read on. If I know I'm in a good book when I just want to keep turning the page, and I'm sure we all share that experience. It's midnight, we really should be going to bed, but one more page, one more chapter. Thank you. Okay, I might, in the absence of any more questions, mind you, I'm pulling down the wrong thing. I might talk a little bit about the research for this, because some of the, I mean, this was, I think this is my 11th book, but this is probably my favorite book to write. Because I'd really loved taking a break from writing Australian crime fiction set in the 70s and 80s and 90s Perth, which I do love doing, but it's really, again, you want to kind of screw down the tension within the story. You want to make it as a crime story as tight as it possibly can, and some of that involves using quite a spare language. So what these two novels did was allow me to dive deep into that beautiful, luxuriant, laconic, melodic, poetic 19th century English, when English really was a kind of a developing language, and it still is, of course. But then it was a time when almost nobody was literate. Everyone spoke English, of course, and all the varieties of English, but very few people could read or write. So what I tried to capture in this novel was that the way that ordinary people spoke. The problem there, of course, is most novels written in the 19th century, obviously written by literate people, and often for a kind of a middle-class audience. So it's very hard to find out how people actually spoke. And one great resource I found early on was the Old Bailey Online, where you can go and maybe see one or two of your ancestors standing before the beak, getting sentenced, unfortunately, to be sent to Australia. But some of the transcripts of the, and certainly the case with Yankee Sullivan as well, some of the transcripts of the court proceedings, you get to hear people as they kind of actually spoke. So I really tried to do that with this one. For Yankee Sullivan, I've created a kind of a hybrid language. He's from Cork in Ireland. He grew up in Whitechapel in East London. He spent a lot of time in Australia as a convict, mixing with people from other countries and other parts of Britain, other parts of the world. And then he spent a fair bit of time in America as well. So I've created this kind of hybrid 19th century language. He speaks with great fluidity when he's on a roll. And that was, of course, a great pleasure for me, having a character who actually wants to talk. But much of the research for this, another fantastic resource, of course, for anybody writing historical fiction, is Trove. I got to find some of his early newspaper articles written about him when he was in trouble for boxing, when he's in trouble for absconding, and sometimes less is more. So, and I've reproduced all of these in the novel as well. The newspaper articles written about him, some excerpts from the books written about him. Sometimes it'll just say something like, he was flogged 50 times, and with no detail at all about it. And of course, flogging was such a cruel punishment. It actually, the horribleness of the situation comes across more when you use less. So Trove is a great resource. But then I was lucky enough also to go to New York and San Francisco and Cork and London after I won an award, and I had a little bit of prize money to spend. So you really, as a writer, you just can't beat going somewhere and walking around. Even though the 6th Ward streets that Yankee Sullivan lived in New York, then the biggest slum in the world, according to Charles Dickens, where he grew up in Cork, has changed, and Whitechapel, of course, where I lived for a bit in London, has changed remarkably. But still, walking around those streets is an amazing thing. So let me dip into some questions. Wendy, could you tell us some more? Wendy Kendall, could you tell us some more about your teaching of writing courses and process? Well, I love being a creative writing teacher. I started off teaching in the prison system over here in WA. I taught at Casuarina, which is our West Australian maximum security prison. And I kind of drifted into teaching at the Centre for Aboriginal Studies first, and then I teach mainstream students creative writing now. Most of my job, to be fair, these days is supervising masters and PhD students, which is a job I love. And the university I work for, Curtin University, we've been lucky lately. We've had some fantastic graduates, some who've gone on to become, really, really, really well-respected writers in Australia. But I do keep my hand in teaching undergraduate students. I teach genre fiction, travel fiction, sometimes short fiction. And I do love it because I love my students. They're a mix of ages and people and backgrounds. But the one thing that unites them, of course, is they're old enough to choose creative writing at a time when, recent government changes have been quite punitive in terms of the fees that are now charged for humanities students. But still, they're there in the class, they're keen, they're eager, they read, they write, some wonderful writers amongst them. And it's just a great atmosphere, in the class. And what I also really like, and which constantly surprises me, because I've been writing for a long time now, and writing for me is quite an intuitive process, even though I teach writing. What constantly surprises me is the way that, because I'm teaching, I need to remind myself of certain things, and the way that those little reminders feed into my own writing practice still now after all those kinds of years as well. So I do like teaching creative writing. I have a lot of respect for my students and a lot of respect for teachers in general, whether you're teaching primary school or high school. It's a tough job, and particularly secondary school teaching is one I'm very familiar with. My wife's a high school English teacher. It makes university teaching look quite easy. But so I hope that answers your question, Wendy. If you've got anything more specific about how I teach, the great thing is we get to choose readings. At the moment, I'm teaching a genre fiction class, so I get to teach crime fiction and science fiction and fantasy fiction and all of the stuff that I really like. So it's very enjoyable. And I've done a lot of different jobs, and I'd be quite happy to go back to being a bartender, but I'm pretty happy teaching writing as well. So if there's any other questions, do kind of jump in. If not, I'll talk a little bit more, I suppose, about the writing process with this one. Normally when I write crime fiction, even though I can't, for the life of me, I can't plan books out. I tried once and I literally lasted half a page before my story started veering off in an unusual direction. So I'd love to be a planner or a plotter rather than a pantser, but that's not quite me. With this one, with the crime novels though, despite the fact that I'm a bit of a pantser and I write largely intuitively, they do tend to proceed in a pretty linear fashion. All my crime novels, I have multiple characters working because I like the way that, particularly when you're talking about something like crime, different perspectives can provide different perspectives on something which is often pretty muddy, often not kind of very clear. So I like using that kind of structure, moving from one character to the next character, and then the next character, hopefully ending each chapter on a point of rising tension. This one is similar in the sense that I've got three main characters. I've got Yankee Sullivan, I've got young Thomas Crane, who is the journalist character, and I've got Yankee's poor wife because she's just had a baby. She's also married to another Australian man. Again, this is based on a true story. A merchant who bitterly hates Yankee Sullivan, and so she's in a very difficult situation as well. She has no money, no income. Her husband is in jail, probably on death row. So I move in the same way from character to character to character, but the process for this one wasn't linear, unlike my other stories. Sometimes I would just write one line in a day and I'd force myself to stop and try and make it the best line I could possibly write, or I'd just write a paragraph. And the story moves backwards and forwards in time, and particularly as Yankee Sullivan's health deteriorates, the stories kind of move outside rather than just being a dialogue-driven kind of interaction between characters. He embarks on some memories of when he was a kid, memories of when he was being transported. So yeah, it was the structure or the writing process for this one was unusual because some of those things I wrote first ended up at the end of the novel, and some of the things I wrote at the end of the novel ended up being, literally the first page or the first kind of couple of pages. So that was pretty fascinating. So Janie wants to know what the next novel I'm working on is. I've got another crime novel coming out around this time next year. It's using the same character as a novel I wrote a couple of years ago called True West, which explored, because I like to use crime fiction, I suppose you call them social crime novels. I like them to explore certain historical things which can say something about the world we live in now. So True West was about Perth's kind of shameful neo-Nazi history in the late 1980s. And the character from that, Lee Southern, he's coming back for a second spin, completely different kind of plot. But that's going to be the next novel. And I'm also writing another crime novel, but set on the high seas, looking at the fishing industry, some of the bad practices going on there, the pillaging of the oceans. And I'm also going to be working on, hopefully, a non-fiction book, because I've written a few non-fiction books. A non-fiction book for Sea Shepherd and about some of the things they're doing off the coast of West Africa, and some of the great stuff they're doing for African nations, basically acting as a kind of a privateer navy for those countries that don't have a navy and can't protect their own kind of territorial waters. And the research for that is fantastic as well. Now, Claire, we've probably got time for one more question. Claire Austin has asked, I've not read a lot of crime but love historical novels. Which of your books would you recommend as a good starting point? Are your crime novels in a series? Not really a lot of people love historical novels. So I think for the historical novels, I would start with these two. You don't necessarily need to read them in order. Yankee Sullivan, the main character in this book, is in this book, but it's a kind of walk-on, walk-off role. This novel is narrated, the main character is a 14-year-old boy, which was also a bit of a departure for me. You don't need to read them in order. They're similar in style, but very different in structure. The crime novels, I've written a series with my main character, Frank Swan. It's set in Perth in the 1970s and 80s. The first novel in that was Line of Sight, and the most recent was Shore Leave. And I mentioned True West with Lee Sullivan as a main character. And that's, up until now, has been a kind of a standalone novel, but there is a second one coming out. So you could start, like most crime writers will tell you, you write them to they're part of a series, but you never really write a crime novel so that it has to be read in sequence. They should all, well, at least in my case, you should be able to pick up any one of them and get an idea of the character and get an idea of the kind of the world that they move in and through. So those are the two historical ones, the Coves and the Sawdust House. The Sawdust House is obviously the newest one. It's only recently out. That's, like I said, it was a real favourite of mine. I just loved writing it, mainly because I just fell in love with the kind of characters. And hopefully some of that love for my characters shines through in the writing as well. Okay, so one more question, I think. Deborah has asked, my father was in the army in Malaysia and met, yes, that's right, a family whose surname was Whish-Wilson, and would you be related? That's right. So my dad, that you'd be talking about my dad, I guess, Deborah. So in fact, I grew up for a little while in Malaysia and Singapore when my dad was, he's a Vietnam vet. He was in Vietnam for a while. And so myself, my brother and my sister, we lived in Singapore and Malaysia for a bit. That's the Tassie side of my family. All the Whish-Wilsons are a big clan in Tasmania. We're a Scottish soldiering family that came out, so I can't help myself, historical fiction, came out to Australia in the 1860s, 1870s and settled around the kind of the Springfield, Scottsdale area where some of them kind of still live. But I'll pass on, Deborah, that news to my dad, who I'll be speaking to this weekend, certainly because of the football being on. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you, Dex, very much for facilitating, and Cheryl. It's great to speak to the Better Reading family. I'll try and answer any other questions that pop up on the Facebook page for anybody who I neglected or missed. I apologise for that. But otherwise, happy reading, and hopefully I'll get to meet you in person one day. Thank you.